Hi, everybody, and welcome to our panel on games as story generators. We're going to start with brief introductions of our panelists. I'm going to ask Miriam if you can introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Miriam Palusari Eladhari. I am in Stockholm now since 2 weeks at Stockholm University at the DSV. And I've been working on narrative games since the 2000 or something. This is like an obsession of mine, how to look at games as story generators. And I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent. Max, can I ask you to go next?
Sure. So hi, yeah, I'm Max Kraminski. I use them pronouns. I'm a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz in the Expressive Intelligence Studio with Michael and Noah, or Michael Mateus, Noah Ordrup-Fruin. I've been doing a lot of work on emergent narrative, on story sifting, sort of extending James Ryan's work a little bit, and then also on sort of AI-human co-creativity broadly. So this is like right in my area of interest.
Perfect. Antonios, can I ask you to go next?
Sure, I'm Antonios Liapis. I'm at the University of Malta. I basically work on AI that co-creates with humans, usually on the visual side, but I also like to dabble in tabletop role-playing games, and I made a game that has a storytelling aspect, so I'm very happy to be here as well. Great.
And then last but not least, Anne.
Hey everyone, I'm Anne Sullivan. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor at Georgia Tech. And what?
Sorry, go ahead.
I didn't think that was funny.
It was just the hesitation, I apologize.
Oh, I'm like, wait, who am I? What do I do? And let's see, I have been interested in narrative for a very long time as well, looking at both AI frameworks for supporting playable narratives and also looking at tangible narratives, particularly through crafts. And Matthew, you actually forgot to introduce yourself.
No, it was intentional because now I can just do this. And go directly into, we've got a small opening presentation. I am Matthew Gusdile. I am an assistant professor at the University of Alberta. I use he, him pronouns. My interest in narrative come from the very beginning of my PhD and a little bit earlier when I did undergrad research with Brian McGurko, interested in improvisational narratives. And it's mostly gone to the side, but simultaneously to that, similarly to Antonios, I've been very into tabletop role-playing games and very interested in the idea generally of PCG and how we can think about things that we don't typically consider to be PCG as PCG. So the way that this panel is going to work is that I've put together a brief presentation to give you a general sense of the sort of space that we're interested in for this panel. After that, we're going to start with one question that we sort of handpicked out to get us started. And then after that, we're hoping that the wonderful members of our audience in the chat will join us in asking us questions and getting us into discussion and arguing with us and so on and so forth until we hit our allotted time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So everybody just introduce themselves. But again, we've got Miriam, me, Max, Antonius, and Anne. 5 great people, well, at least 4. And I'm very happy that we can all be here for this. So the big idea here is that games can be operated as story generators. That's like the one sentence pitch of this panel, and it's one of the few things that all of the panelists collectively agree upon, which is excellent. Now, what does that mean? The basic idea is that if you're a person, you can play a game as if it is a tool to generate a story. Now, there's lots of particular implementations of this. For example, the game you might be playing is Dwarf Fortress, and the story you're producing might be a webcomic named The Little Cheesemaker by Mistim Wildream Klonazem, also known as Misty. Now, this is just one example that I've grabbed from a whole wiki article on Dwarf Fortress webcomics. This is a very common thing for specifically Dwarf Fortress, but for games generally, that you've played a game and the experience of playing the game, what you did in the game, the choices that you made, you then translate into some form of narrative, into some kind of storytelling. So This is very broad, right? And there's many questions and we don't have the answers. That's why this is a panel, not a paper. But for example, okay, we just set up that a person can play a game to produce a narrative. But what if the game already has a narrative and the person then takes that and produces another narrative? Does that still count? Does the narrative have to be choice-based? Does it matter if the output narrative is something like fan fiction as opposed to, an entirely distinct piece of work? Open questions. There's also questions around different types of games. So Crusaders Kings 3 just came out last week, I want to say. And it's a game basically all about just like playing storytelling with sort of European, North African, and West Asian countries and people. Okay, so people obviously produce stories there, but what about games like No Man's Sky, right? Which is very player driven. You're sort of just wandering around this giant sandbox, doing whatever you want, motivated by yourself. Okay, you might say, all right, stories definitely can be produced there. Well, what about Fire Emblem Three Houses, a very narrative focused, pre-authored narrative focused game in which you are a protagonist making choices in this world. Now, you're still making choices, so maybe you can still produce unique stories there. But then what about a game like 2019's Control, where you don't really make any choices? It's just sort of your typical like shooter cutscene. Can you still think of the player as producing a unique story in this case? Open questions. We don't know. Members of this panel agree or disagree with that. But to get us started, I did want to really quickly just shill just for a second about a paper that the members of this panel all co-wrote, which is on tabletop role-playing games as, procedural, not procaudial, apologies about that, content generation, which was at the PCG workshop just this year, just on Monday. So if you're interested to dive into this more, we've done a little bit more thinking of it since coming up with this panel, and I do recommend checking out that paper with procedural spelled correctly. With that, let's go ahead and get going with the starting question, which is, what is your favorite game you've played recently that you thought of as a story generator? I'm going to ask that we go through the panelists in the same order that we did for the intro. So going with Miriam, then Max, then Antonios, then Anne, and then back to me. And then we will open up the floodgates for members of the chat to ask us questions, to say contentious things, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully everybody still keeping it nice and pleasant. And I will be somewhat semi-moderating this in terms of trying to keep us all within 3 or 4 minutes of answers at the most. All right? So with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Miriam to tell us about a recent favorite game of hers.
So my recent favorite games of playing a story generator is Microscope, which is a completely analog game, only working with little pieces of paper according to a quite rigorous way of playing. So it's a way of generating a kind of backstory just with a set of rules, a set of people playing, and pen and paper, and really being able to spawn really fantastic things. That having said, that being on the one side, on the completely analog frame, I have 2 games that I want to play in the future, which are completely digital, and that is that of VSpace being done at UC Santa Cruz, and the other one is the work that Victor Gustafsson is doing on narrative substrates, where he kind of combines like persistent objects into games. So that is like my 2 complete polarities, kind of very, very analog, relying on human creativity, and the other one when we use our human creativity to create systems to help us. So.
Fantastic. Max, can we ask you to go next?
Yeah, sure. So the game that I've been playing as a story generator, I think most recently and most obsessively, has been Stellaris, which is it's in the Paradox family, similar to Crusader Kings, but is, I guess, more oriented towards strategy slightly. But the thing that I love about it is that it lets you sort of create a sci-fi universe with a bunch of recurring sort of alien civilizations, basically, and design them yourself, pick their traits, pick their portraits, and then sort of place them in the world and see what happens as you interact with them. And the thing that I really love about this game is that you can kind of play it as almost like a gardening game in the sense of just sitting back and letting it kind of do its thing, in addition to trying to like actively strategize to take over the galaxy as your particular civilization or whatever. And I've sort of written a whole bunch of stories about the I guess, ongoing sci-fi universe that has come out of the procedurally generated civilizations interacting with my custom created ones. You can take the proc gen ones and sort of add them to your library and then have them sort of be force spawned in later games and sort of build up an ongoing canon almost.
Nice. Okay, Antonios.
Stellaris was in my, well, it is in my favorite game I've played, but actually when I saw this question very recently, because I forgot about this panel, I had another plan to talk about my own game, but the game that has really grasped me in terms of the mechanics of that facilitate story generation, that's where I kind of like want to steer this discussion towards, is actually, and I'm not sure if it was in your list, Betrayal Legacy. So it's a board game where you basically, you play these weird ghost stories, and there's a lot of randomness and different stories may emerge in terms of combinations of items and where you pick up the cursed item, etc. What Betrayal Legacy does really well is that it allows for some continuity, and that's where the stories kind of like come to life, because you write down things on a piece of paper, even if it's just a name, then it shows up later in your later games, and you remember just the, like, you have the name of your character there, of your old character. So it makes this kind of history, and it removes some cards that that are not part of your story because you chose a different omen or a different curse. So it really gives you the frame, but it doesn't really tell you what is going on. So you kind of like have these hints, and then you populate, you know, why this is there based on your own previous memories. And everybody has their own different memories of this is a good item, this is a bad item, etc.
Fantastic. Anne.
Okay, I'm feeling a little self-conscious about my choice, but I focused on recent game, and basically the only thing I've played recently is Animal Crossing, but hear me out. Once you get past all of the like weird quest stuff and actually start playing the game, there's a lot of environmental storytelling that happens in which you can create this world. You have control over like the mountains and the valleys and the, you know, rivers, even where you put people. They have different personalities, so if you want high conflict, you can put personalities that don't get along very well next to each other. But unlike oh wait, no, I was gonna keep existential crisis out of it. At this moment, I find it's very lovely because everything has a happy ending. So it's quite enjoyable. Even when characters fight, it's just a matter of listening empathetically or you know, running a gift to somebody else, and then woo, everybody makes up and it's great. So that is my answer.
Fantastic. And I'll end us off with the first question about what is your favorite game you've played recently that you've thought of as a story generator by talking about Blazeball. So Blazeball is a, I guess we could call it a strong simulationist game in which there is a simulated baseball league. We can pick, for example, the Tigers, the best team. We can take a look at their various individual players. Each of these players is simulated by a set of stats. We have things like their batting, their pitching, their base running, their defense, but also things like their evolution, their pregame ritual, their coffee style, their blood type, their fate, and of course, their soul scream. What would a baseball player be without a soul scream? And I've been really enjoying Blazeball as an example of a story generator, as there's this very fun interplay between the players of the game, who are the fans of these virtual teams, and the game itself. So just as like one quick example, as like a fun story to tell about this game, is to, Ricardo says, Matthew is a Tigers fan, it's over. Hey, I came up with one stripe, or one tiger, many stripes, so I'm sorry, Tigers for life. Last season, at the end of each season, the fans of the game get to vote with fake in-game money. There's no link to real currency, don't worry. With fake in-game money on certain blessings. One of the blessings included the ability to grab basically the 14th most popular player. Now, of course, because it's Blazeball, you have the possibility, and given certain weather conditions, for the umpires to incinerate players. Then they die, which tends to happen when you're incinerated. But a dead player can still show up on this top popular players list. So the Blazeball community decided that they would try to do some necromancy by putting a dead player in that 14th slot and then bringing them back to life. This succeeded, and now we have a situation where that undead player is this revenant who is taking out other players, basically leading other players to be killed because we committed Blazeball necromancy, which is fantastic. And this wonderful interplay between the designers or directors of the game and the players of the game in terms of like the mechanics that the designers came up with and the way that the players then play with those mechanics to create their own stories. So I think this is a very exciting example of this specific thing we're interested in. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen like that. I'm going to turn to, I don't know how, nobody knows how to pronounce Blazeball. It's pronounced Blazeball.
Max does.
Making fun of it. Well, okay. Well, of course,
I have a strongly worded opinion about it.
Well, you can have that. We're allowed to have a contentious argument here, but probably not about this. Let's see if we have anybody in the chat have a question. I think I saw a question from Mike quite a while ago. Well, here's one from Henri. Question prompt. In the Dwarf Fortress culture, failure and things that result in failure are often tagged as fun in the internal wiki and community. How do you see failure-focused games as story generators? RimWorld might also fit in this category. So I'll give our panelists a second to think about how failure-focused games can be thought of as story generators. And then I'll ask if any of our 5 panelists have a particular interest in going first with an answer here. I can get us started if people need more time to think. So I think failure is the most interesting thing in games for story generation in terms of, or it can be. When failure is interesting, I think it makes for a game that is a very good story generator. I think when failure is boring or just sort of like a reset, that's not particularly interesting. There's a notion, particularly in tabletop role-playing games, called failing forward, which is basically the idea that instead of leading to a reset or requiring just more work, failure should always push the narrative forward. The simplest version of this is maybe in the Powered by the Apocalypse engine, which is a particular kind of tabletop role-playing game framework, where anytime you roll, the players roll 2 dice at a time, 2d6, and if they get under a 6, then the GM has total control about what happens. They fail, and the GM says what happens. If it's a 7 and 9, it's a mixed success. They get what they want, but the GM adds a complication. And on a 10+, they get exactly what they want. But on those 6-, you get all these opportunities to push the story forward. And PBTA games are written so that the GMs have moves that they can do only when failure occurs. That otherwise, the GMs, the people who are controlling the game, don't get to make moves. They don't roll die. And so because of that, you're really incentivized to make your failures interesting. And I think that that's more and more what digital games should be doing as well to engage with this kind of thing. Have I vamped enough that any of my other panelists would like to take a swing at that question?
I'm gonna kind of riff a little bit, I guess.
Please.
I don't know about like whether failure is integral to storytelling in games or anything like that. I do know that in Dwarf Fortress specifically, one of the things that I think about a lot is how there's sort of a built-in sort of tragic arc to every civilization that you start. in that there is no good ending to a Dwarf Fortress civilization, basically. It's always just a matter of like gradually building up your resources until something happens that is too overwhelming and you all like everything sort of falls apart, basically. And I think that that kind of built-in arc is a strong sort of pattern for games that are trying to generate stories, because it produces like sort of an inherent period of narrative tension building and sort of encourages the player almost to do increasingly hubristic things until such time as they finally take on, like, bite off more than they can chew or whatever. So I think like failure is important in that sense, in that it sort of brings the arc to a closure, or like shapes the arc of a Dwarf Fortress playthrough.
So then are you saying that basically in a Dwarf Fortress, from like the design standpoint, that things are pushing you towards failure, that it's like everything is failure focused in that way? As what
Yeah, I think failure is one of the sort of like things that is implied by the design, even if it's not like inevitable, strictly speaking.
Right. Any other panelists, or should we go to another question? I'll give maybe 10 seconds.
I've been taking out the questions from the chat and reposting them. So Phil's question was the first one. If you're looking for another question.
Sure. I see that you reposted Mike's. Would you mind just reading Phil's? I don't see it. Oh, no, I do. I got it. Okay. If you'd like to read, please.
In the future, I'll read. Good point. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, please. No, please go ahead and read. The future is now.
Okay. This is actually the contention, is who's gonna moderate. Okay, so Phil asks, is any game that has YouTube and or Twitch Let's Play considered a story generation game, given that given they are allowing people to keep an audience with the gameplay?
My short answer would just be yes. I think so. I think there are members of this panel who disagree, and I would love for them to talk now and to disagree with me.
I am not one of the people that would disagree.
Hi, Antonios.
Hi. No, I don't disagree. Obviously, we're talking about, well, hold on. We're talking about YouTube videos, YouTube playthroughs that are basically telling a story, and the caster is telling their story through it. And in that regard, I think it's fine. I don't think it spoils the fun for me when I'm playing it myself, because I weave my own stories. It really depends, obviously, if you're playing a narrative heavy, like narrative structured visual novel or adventure game, that would spoil it. But I think, and this might be the contentious point, the title of the Story Generators panel is not about these kinds of games, right? It's more about the games that offer you more opportunities to craft kind of stories or retell them in a different way. So to me, it's not really an issue if someone is doing it on YouTube and putting the fun.
So I think this is the place where we have a contention then, because I think that even those games are story generators, or can be played as story generators, is maybe the better way to say it. So for example, I'm going to try to be careful here with my language, as it's a little bit rough. So there was a Twitch streamer I was watching recently who was playing a very common or fairly popular interactive fiction game called Danganronpa. It's a visual novel. I don't recommend looking it up. It's pretty trashy. It involves high school students killing each other. But yeah, it's not great. And it has all kinds of not great themes. So really, I really don't recommend looking it up. But the Twitch streamer in this case was a queer guy with mostly a queer chat. And because of that, they ended up sort of crafting a separate narrative from the one that the game is putting forward, which sort of, to put it nicely, got around the sort of icky elements. And basically ignored the things that didn't fit, right? And I agree with Antonios that certain games are better for doing this kind of like story generation thing in terms of giving you more verbs to express your story in the game. But I think that ignoring parts of a game is a verb that is important, right? I think this touches on like Max's work, for example, with story sifting, right? I can take a pre-authored narrative and I can say, ooh, I don't like this and I don't like this, but I like these chunks. So I'm going to take these, and that's still a form of producing a new story, at least to me.
Yeah, there's also a term that I really like that one of my the Caves of Cud one of the Caves of Cud developers, Jason Greenblatt, uses, which is a story in live edit. And that concept of a story in live edit to me sort of exemplifies what you see in a lot of streams of games, I think, especially where the streamer is trying to tell a story about the gameplay as they go. And like edit here definitely explicitly includes redaction of things, or we're going to ignore that because it doesn't fit the narrative we're trying to currently construct.
I agree too. The performance that is created through this Twitch and replays, that is a narrative in itself, a game being played. And also the fact that you can see what parts are meaningful tells you about something about the base narrative, that this new narrative becomes a layer upon. So I would definitely say that it is a narrative and an extremely important one.
And my 2 cents is just because it may not be a terribly good generator doesn't mean it's not a generator. And also, it seems like there's this tension between the stories that you know, a designer may want to tell or may want the interactors to tell through playing, and then the stories that the interactors actually want to make. And sometimes, you know, we don't need to have this like beautifully crafted story to enjoy it. And so that's why I think it's just as important to remember that those are still stories, even if they may not, like a drama manager would be like, wow, this is utter crap. But I've read enough fan fiction to know that there's a lot of people out there that want stories that no drama manager would ever pass off as a good story.
Okay, we managed to have a question that we all answered on. Did anybody feel like they really wanted to get anything in here? If not, I think let's go over to the next one. That's all right.
Do you want to read Mike's question?
Please.
Sorry, I don't mean to take over, Matthew.
No.
Okay. Okay, so Mike Cook wants to know, I know some of the panelists have done work on player retelling, which is really important to me. This is a big part of how I share games with my friends. I'm in a lockdown Blood Bowl league with friends, which has given rise to some amazing sports narratives. Yay! Is that story generation to you, or is it something else, something more social or outside of the game? Question mark.
I will happily jump on that one if people don't have strong immediate thoughts. The thing that really stands out to me about sports narratives is that sports are like some of the oldest story generators, I think, and especially like in the sort of context of games, especially like the thing about sports that's interesting to me, at least, I've never been interested in the actual sort of play of the sports particularly, is the stories that come out of them. And that's what I think what Blaseball is right now like very strongly exemplifying is it's all about the fan woven narratives around the game. You don't even get to see the games really because they're not modeled in that, I think, high level of fidelity that you'd need. But you get to see the outcomes of them, which are the interesting things. And then there's also this great work by Marie-Laure Ryan on, I want to say it's like chronicle and plot in the baseball broadcast or something like that talks specifically about like sports announcers and their like sort of production of narrative and live edit, basically. So I think that's a cool thing to look at.
I would argue that that is the pinnacle of game narratives, because that means that you have created a system that can create narratives and experiences that are so good that they can result in another narrative that you want to retell to your friends. I mean, that's when a game narrative has succeeded, that it becomes this kind of meta narrative, that this fourth layer of narrative that we have.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's the kind of the holy grail of it, right?
Can I jump in on this? Because I think it's interesting because, you know, like people are invested in the game of whatever sport it is, basically. And that's why the narrative, you know, becomes so much bigger, because the retelling, they feel the energy and the will to do a retelling, which is something that was coming up before as well when we were talking about, you know, story generation, etc. Because you're interested in the game, you want to like change it and adapt it if it was something that you weren't interested in. This is also important when we're talking about generators, right? Like the game, the base activity, the game or sport or whatever it is should be, maybe it doesn't need to be carefully crafted, like I was saying, you know, like it doesn't have to be a good story, but it needs to be something that really excites you. That's also important.
Yeah, I wanted to call to shout out Victor in the chat, who mentions, apologies, Victor, for just calling out your comment like this. But Victor says, I love football as a story generator. Think of how much they spin the background of character, etc. in media. And I think that this is a phenomenon that's really worth looking at in terms of, right, there are entire TV channels, there are entire publications about sports, and they sure don't just show games, right? They also show information about what the players are up to. They talk about their personal lives. They talk about drama between players, or between players and coaches, or between coaches and owners. And so much of, you know, what the game is it's about, or the story of it, right, is about this outside portions of the actual sport experience. And to Antonios's point, I think that these things feed into each other, right? Where the excitement about the game spills out into the excitement about these people as characters in the story, which excites back into the game, right? If you know about a rivalry between two players outside of the game, you are excited when you see them going up against each other in an actual match, right?
Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Senior from PC Gamer. I've just jumped into the chat. Hello, everyone. I wanted to kind of give a shout out to John Boyce, who writes at SB Nation, and he's a master of creating stories out of the NFL, particularly, and just like the simulations that can happen. And I just really wanted to big up his Breaking Madden series in particular. He's done so much good work, but that in particular is a fantastic, perfect example of creating stories out of sports in video games, I think.
Appreciate the comment. Did any of the panelists have anything else that they wanted to jump on with this question, or should we go for another one? Okay, I think we're ready to move on. Anne, is there another question already queued up, or should we prompt people for questions or ask one of our own?
Oh no, we have 6 questions already.
Oh,
So this one is from Joshua McCoy. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Josh.
In your opinions, is there a meaningful difference in the stories generated with strong support in game mechanics versus those created through metagaming? Here, and I'm going to copy and paste this into the chat in case anybody like me, it's easier to understand words you read than words.
Hang on, I didn't get it. I mean, was it the difference between the kind of mechanics and then what?
Meaningful difference in the stories generated with game mechanics versus those created through metagaming.
So is the question here kind of about like, did it actually happen almost, do you think? In the sense of like actually happened in the simulation?
Like, I can see a lot of things happening, like as a result, metagaming happening as a result of the mechanics. Like often instrumental game mechanics lead to really profound drama because of the metagaming. I've seen that tons of time and lived through it. And one of the interesting things is, how can you take the bits of the metagaming and make it part of the mechanics in order to enhance the mechanics, to make it even better for those who aren't like LARPers, for example, who go ahead and use mechanics in creative ways. Like, what kind of cues can you take out of the metagamings and embed it into the game mechanics? Muting myself now.
So Josh still hasn't said anything, but the way that you're on the correct track. There's room for interpretation. I was originally thinking of a game versus, Josh, you're just here. Do you want to just?
Can we just,
please speak to us.
Yeah, it's there. I didn't want to, you're the panelist, not me.
No, please.
The question's there now.
Josh, say.
Please speak, Josh, please.
Yeah, sure. So I was thinking of the difference between how people play a game and spin narratives around the game, and it's like mechanics as designed, versus like people who would like play like a randomizer of the game or a speed run of the game and construct other narratives with it. This is very much related to the Twitch question earlier. So it may have already been answered by you all.
And so just to remind you, the question is if there's a meaningful difference between those two.
So I think that this maybe gets to a fundamental distinction between some of the panelists. The way that I think about this is in terms of really using the framing of thinking this as a story generator. So essentially, if it's a story generator, if a game is a story generator or can be used as one, then we have to think about what are the operators that the game can do in terms of producing stories, or what are the operators that the player can do using the game as a tool to create stories. And I think that distinction is important, right? Because the player can do a lot of things that aren't supported by the game directly, right? The player could mod the game. The player could, as we talked about previously, ignore certain aspects of the game, or randomize or speed run or hack, right? There's lots of things the players can do that are not directly supported by the mechanics of the game in terms of producing narrative. So I think we can make that distinction in terms of what are the operators that are producing stories that are primarily in control of the player and that the player can mess around with, and what are the operators that can produce stories that are created from the game itself, that are drawn from the game itself by the designers of said game. So that's the distinction for me.
I think that's a really good point. But I would add that a lot of players find that very daunting. I think if some players, if they're presented with so many options and ways of expressing themselves, they don't necessarily enjoy that based on the people I've interviewed and talked to. Some people just like a linear game. And I think it's interesting, how do you coax those players into being expressive and in a sandbox environment in a game, which is where the best stories come from.
I believe there's a way to do that, to be honest. I mean, you can do more prompts, because a while ago I made a game that was a card-based that had basically, you get just these cards and are supposed to craft stories out of them. A bit like Once Upon a Time, a bit more structure with it. I'm not going to get into that. And people were really shy to actually get, into that kind of storytelling feel. But if you give them some constraints, or you give them some prompts, or you tell them this needs to be a story about treachery, right? Then they are much quicker to, pick it up, and then you can take away these wheels, and they will still keep going. So it's just the first step, I think, that is the hardest. It depends on the player, obviously. But.
I'd love to hear from Anne, Miriam, or Max for this question as well, because we haven't heard from y'all for a hot second.
Yeah, I'm directly actually going to respond to what Antonios just said. That's one of the 4 sort of design patterns that we saw in the work that we did on generative games as storytelling partners, basically trying to assess what sort of, looking at games that players use for retelling a lot as sort of creativity support tools for storytelling, basically, and trying to figure out what sort of barriers to creativity they're addressing. So one of those is getting off the ground in the first place, the fear of the blank canvas. And then there's also getting stuck halfway through, which is writer's block. There's a couple others as well. So that might be an interesting sort of paper to look up in that context. And then also I would throw in too that responding to a few different things that have been said in the chat, I think in the last couple minutes here, there's sort of a spectrum that people are sort of calling out between the games that are providing raw material and sort of placing it entirely on the players to assemble that material into a story, versus the games that are providing more narrative elements that are sort of predefined by the story almost, or by the story as the game is telling it almost. And I think one of the interesting things to look at here is this spectrum of closure almost, in terms of how much work the player is expected to put in to connect the disparate threads or sort of plot elements or whatever into a single coherent narrative. And that sort of, I guess, how far spaced apart the threads are almost is, I think, one of the really interesting design tensions to pull on here. And it's the same as in other media, where you can make things that are less requiring of closure or more requiring of closure, and they're both good for different reasons. And I think part of this is figuring out what are the genre locations almost that you can be along this spectrum, in terms of is this game entirely about sort of constructing a story on your own? Is this game about mediated co-construction of a story? Is this game about something else entirely, and you might make stories incidentally, that sort of thing?
Max, you're touching upon something really important, like the notion of genre. Because one of the things that's really interesting to think about is, how do you create really deep drama, and what kind of things do you draw upon? in players and what can they put in for cooperation. That's something that I work with a lot. But on the other hand, we also have the genre of detective series. Like how do we piece together clues? Like we're not really caring about our own personal drama. We're interested in solving a detective mystery as a particular genre. And we have the sports thing, succeeding and all that. So bundling everything together as this is the kind of thing, it doesn't really work. We also need to see, just as you say, Max, on the genre that we're looking at. So I'm afraid I kind of lost the first question though. I'm trying
It's okay, it's okay. As long as we're saying interesting things, that's our only job. Anne, did you have anything you wanted to add on this?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it quick because I know we're running out of time. For me, the question of, is there a meaningful difference between the two? Meaningful difference to whom? I think for the players, I'm not sure it's a meaningful difference because, you know, the story that they're interested in generally is the one that they're telling. I mean, yes, there's interest in the story that's embedded in the game, but how they play through it is, you know, where the interests are for the most part. So whether they're getting to that through metagaming or getting to that through the game mechanics, I don't know that it matters. It'd be interesting to maybe ask and see, do some sort of study. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I agree. Can we grab another question? I think we probably have time for one more.
Okay. Well, the next one on the list is from Fawad, who is also here, so he can answer any, clarify if we need it. Okay, so his question is there any kind of quality measure for game-generated stories? Could we see a story so good that it could be a standalone book or movie for audiences outside of the game community? My answer is yes. I mean, probably it has happened.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, great.
We all agree.
Glad we could clear that up, Fawad.
It's absolutely yes. Also, I see this in pen and paper RPGs where people create their own characters and universes, and they actually do turn into fiction that is put into books and spread around. And it's a delightful thing. I think it's amazing.
Sure. All right. Let's try one more question.
All right. The next question is from Lisa. Oh, apparently it's a few. I have a few related questions, maybe different phrasing of the same fundamental question. This is probably referring to something earlier. Do you all think an actual player is necessary to have a narrative? Could a zero-player game or maybe a physics simulator be a sufficient substrate for a narrative? Ooh, chew on that one.
That's a good one, because I think definitely yes, in order to make it like a meaningful experience. But on the other hand, like saying a narrative, like this is a story told, having an interesting sequence of events that can become a narrative is like a different issue. Like if it is interesting enough, player will always riff out of it and make it interesting enough.
Yeah, one of the examples that my mind immediately goes to when I think about a physics simulator being a substrate for a narrative is this example from a talk that I saw on ambient play by someone from NYU, I forget their name, which included as a form of ambient play, looking at sort of water droplets on a window when it's been raining out, sort of like trickling down the window and sort of merging with one another and splitting and stuff like that. And you can sort of impose on that a narrative of two different droplets racing one another to get to the bottom, for instance. So you've definitely like created a narrative. It's interesting to you. There's not like a lot of support being provided for you in the construction of that narrative. There's not necessarily a lot of like narrative material there, but humans are very good at imposing narrative onto a lot of different things. And so I think that there's maybe two different questions here. One of which is, can a narrative come out of things like that? I think yes, absolutely. The other question is maybe like, will that lend itself to narrativization more so than any other random sequence of events, which I don't know for sure.
That's a good distinction. I like that as a distinction in terms of if we just have, if this is like Bayesian, right? Like if our prior is something, where that something might be 2 raindrops on a window, or it might be a specifically handcrafted narrative, or it might be a sandbox RPG, right? Which of these are going to be more likely to produce narrative? And it probably differs between people. The tact I was going to take before Max said the really interesting thing was that I think that in all of these cases, there isn't really the 0-player game. I think observation is a kind of play, right? You are still making a choice about what to observe. So to me, that still indicates play. Now, you could have a simulation running in the background, and there's be a lot of things you chose not to pay attention to. The things you did choose to pay attention to are probably interesting in some way. And if they're interesting some way, I'm going to think that's probably going to lead you to have more potential to narrativize them in some way, if you're likely to do something like that.
So I just wanted to jump in. First of all, I've definitely heard people tell stories about Cran Physics Deluxe. So definitely player-made narratives there. But on Matthew's point, just to take it to an extreme and be, add some contention, does that mean that Netflix is a game?
Bandersnatch.
Oh no.
Absolutely not.
I feel like a
So
game is a game if people use it as a game.
What is a game? Yes, Rogelio, I'm just taking it back to basics here.
Yeah, thank goodness. I was worried we were already on day 2 of FDG. I was worried we weren't going to get what is a game. Antonius, did you want to jump in here, or should we try to go for another?
I did not. No,
I didn't want to touch this one.
There are so many interesting questions in the chat. I'm just getting completely shattered about wanting to talk about all of them.
I know there's some great stuff. We have 10 minutes, unfortunately.
I know.
We're gonna have
Michael Matthias is asking, riffing on Josh's question. It seems like there's a spectrum from games providing raw material out of which players do all of the work, assembling it into a story, versus games that explicitly model their mechanics and simulation story elements that players can manipulate. Right?
I'd agree with that spectrum being a way of framing this, for sure. A useful way to frame this.
I'd say also there's a matter of player expectation. So when a player goes into a game, are they expecting a kind of linear roller coaster experience, or are they going in with the expectation of having to be creative? And I think marketing plays into that, and also the way the game's presented are linked to that as well. I think that's kind of an important point.
It shows lots of ways to bias people. Why don't we try to get one more question from Anne's list in here? We have 9 minutes left. We have 5 panelists. I feel like we can make this work.
Okay. I'm obligated by law to agree with everything Michael Matthias says. Okay, so Henrik asks, what is a good generator anyway? Does it make full stories, or maybe just lay the foundations for the player to feel like there's a story?
Fantastic question. Impossible to answer, which is a great question for a panel.
So I can launch this off if we want. Kate Compton has this great idea of the imagination playground that I've liked a lot in talking about what is a good generator lately. An imagination playground being sort of a set of details that are correlated enough that you feel like there's a right answer almost, or that you feel like there's an obvious connection or set of connections to make between these things, but that sort of leaves that open to interpretation enough that you have some ability to impose yourself in there as well as the player or the experiencer or the interactor or whatever. So Kate was originally talking about this in the context of Twitter bots, and in particular there's one bot that generates little tiny murder mystery scenes basically. But I like this idea of the imagination playground as there is a piece of content that was generated with a hole at the heart of it basically, and the hole is large enough that you can put something interesting in there yourself, but also small enough that it is closable by a human. And what that size actually is might vary from form to form or genre to genre or whatever.
And from players to players as well, right? So there's different people that want different things and like different things.
Miriam or Anne? Do either of you want to jump on this one? If not,
Yeah,
I can.
like just out of the blue, I'm kind of thinking that when you talk about good story generators, I'm seeing 3 different ways of going about it, and creating these systems, having one of the 3 at the heart would probably help for the player. One is where you're looking at the individual, like the development story of an individual, that you know a person, or you have the freedom of creating a very strong individual, a detailed individual, and that becomes the basis of a development story. The other one is looking more at social relationships of lots of characters interacting. I mean, you can see it as a multi-agent simulator, or you can see it as social physics. But basically, looking really at how is the relationship between them creating drama. The other one is the more epic kind of tradition that we have, where we embed meaning and legends into objects and people. That has to do with legends, like how do we embed stories into particular swords or weaponries or kings or queens. But it's all part of a bigger drama. But what you do is really having like these artifact or persons being these kind of strong objects in an epic. So basically, either you have this kind of like self-driving drama, deep psychological thing, you have the relationship drama, closed chamber thing, or you have the epics. Like, we can all do it, all the 3 of them, but I see those as main. And now I'm muting myself again.
Anne, did you want to check on here?
Yeah, that's cool. So, okay, so the question is, what makes a good generator? Good to who, right? Like, is this, you know, good to the designer or good to the player? Because I'm pretty sure the answers might be different. I'm sorry, I keep bringing it back to the player, but I think depending on who your audience is, those generators would be very different. Like, you know, somebody brought up Henry Jenkins and narrative architecture, Colin. And on one hand, yes, having things there for the player to riff on, of course, can be like it's additive, but some people, they need much less and would prefer fewer constraints in that way. And so I don't know, like it really depends on who you're talking about, which I guess is, it feels like a wimpy answer, but you know, what I like to play is very different from what other people like to play for their stories. You know, like earlier on, I said I like to play Animal Crossing because those are the kinds of stories I like right now. But somebody, like a number of people started out playing Animal Crossing that don't play anymore because those were not the stories they were looking for. Yeah, you think you want it, but you don't.
I do think, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hold on. Let's let Anne finish her point.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt, sorry.
Oh, so I mean, that basically was my point. Is just the answer is it depends, right? Because that's the answer to everything. And so I think it's a matter of knowing your audience and knowing what they want, how that generator would look to support them.
Okay. Tom, if you wanted to have a comment here, sure.
Yeah, just briefly, I'd say that I think some formats are deliberately restrictive to storytelling. So, for example, if I'm playing Devil May Cry 5, the only story I can tell is I hit a demon 20 times and it exploded. And that's kind of like just things you can do that game are just so limited in terms of storytelling capacity. So I think we've got to talk about sandboxes and getting away from combat to actually give players the space to create their stories, perhaps.
So I would actually, just to that point, if that's the kind of story you want to tell, then that's a fantastic generator, because it's going to tell a very, like, that it's going to hit the nail on the head for that type of story. Whereas if you're playing some other system, like Animal Crossing is not going to give you that story. So that is not a good generator for what you're looking for.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Anne here. I think that I tend to think of this and most questions around goodness for very subjective things like this in terms of utility. So what is it that a particular actor, a particular agent, a particular person is looking to get out of a generator? So if you as a designer, right, what is useful here? If you as a designer are interested in leading to having a game, a final game, which is going to lead to players of that game producing certain kinds of stories, then okay, you have a very clear metric of success there, which is if people of your game are producing that kind of story. Similarly, if you're a player of a game looking at different games you could be playing, and you, to Anne's point, are looking at producing certain kinds of stories, well, you have a very clear metric of success, right? You're going to play the games which are going to lead you to be able to produce the stories, if that's the thing you're interested in, that you are interested in producing, right? So that's the way that I tend to think about this. And this really just comes down to individual preferences between different players and different designers. Okay, so we are at 11:29. Rather than try to sneak in another question, I think that we should probably just start winding down. I did want to do one last check-in with our great panelists to see if any of you had any final points that you particularly wanted to share. Anne, please.
So I have the rest of the questions. I will copy and paste them into the Discord. And Sam wanted to say hi. I'll put them in the Discord and we can answer them there. So if you are not on the Discord, I will put the link in the chat.
Thanks so much, Anne. Okay, with that, thank you to our fantastic audience. Thank you to my fellow panelists. This was a huge amount of fun. I really appreciate you all making the time. All right, talk to you all later.